The Macchi C.200 Saetta, or Lightning Bolt, was Italy's frontline fighter at the dawn of World War II. On paper, it looked modern, sleek, and deadly. In reality, it terrified many of the very men ordered to fly it. From bizarre design quirks to shocking engineering compromises, the C.200 was a machine pilots respected, but also feared. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on why this Italian fighter was more nightmare than lightning. The first shock for anyone seeing the Macchi C.200 take to the skies was its open cockpit. By 1939, most modern fighters, the Spitfire, Hurricane, even the P-40, had embraced enclosed canopies to give pilots protection, speed, and comfort. Yet, the Saetta looked like something out of the early 1930s, its pilot exposed to the slipstream, rain, and the scorching Mediterranean sun. The oddity wasn't because Italian engineers lacked skill. In fact, the C.200 was originally designed with a modern enclosed cockpit. The problem came from the pilots themselves. Many rejected the glass bubble, claiming they needed to feel the wind on their faces and hear the airflow over the fuselage to sense the aircraft's limits. Others argued that smelling an overheating or oil-burning engine was vital in an age when cockpit gauges weren't always trustworthy. There were other fears too. Early war canopies could jam shut at high speeds, making bailouts nearly impossible. Italian pilots, aware of fragile engines and frequent crash landings, preferred the escape option of simply climbing out. Soviet aviators often flew their Yak fighters with canopies slid open for the same reason. Still, when facing enemy fighters, this throwback design was terrifying. Wind blast made high-speed maneuvers exhausting. Exposure increased frostbite risks at altitude, and visibility through goggles was worse than through a canopy. Allied pilots found comfort inside their sealed cockpits, while Italians often entered combat, already fatigued. For a World War II fighter, the open cockpit wasn't just outdated, it was a dangerous liability that made pilots feel like relics before the fight even began. As if flying without a canopy wasn't stressful enough, the Macchi C.200 added a bizarre design quirk that left many pilots sweating in combat. Its throttle worked backwards. In nearly every Allied and Axis fighter of the era, pushing the lever forward increased power, while pulling it back reduced it. Simple, intuitive, like pushing the accelerator in a car. The C.200 flipped that logic on its head. In the Saetta, pulling the throttle lever back delivered more power, while pushing it forward cut the engine. That might sound trivial on paper, but in the chaos of combat, with bullets flying and adrenaline pumping, instinct takes over. A pilot used to flying other types, say, transitioning from a Fiat CR-42 biplane or later moving on to the more advanced C.202, could easily make the fatal mistake of shoving the throttle forward in a dogfight, only to watch their engine sputter at the worst possible moment. This wasn't just a training nuisance, it directly translated into pilot fear. Imagine diving on a Spitfire, instinctively pushing the throttle forward to chase, only to lose speed as your engine winds down. Even a split-second error meant giving the enemy the upper hand. In tight turn fights where every ounce of power mattered, this reversed control system was a constant source of dread. Why was it designed this way? Historians still debate it. Some suggest it stemmed from older Italian throttle conventions carried over from earlier designs. Others believe it was simply a mistake that stuck. Regardless of the reason, it was one of those quirks that forced pilots to think twice before every move. And in air combat, where hesitation was often fatal, the backwards throttle made the Macchi C.200 a machine that inspired as much fear as loyalty among those who flew it. At the heart of the Macchi C.200 was the Fiat A74, a 14-cylinder radial engine that looked formidable but delivered disappointment. On paper, it displaced a massive 31 litres, making it larger than the Pratt & Whitney engines powering American Wildcats. Yet, Despite its size, the Fiat barely coughed up 870 horsepower, hundreds less than Allied fighters entering the skies at the same time. The reason came down to fuel and supercharging. Italy's aviation industry was shackled to low-octane 87 fuel, while Britain and the US ran engines on 100 octane or higher. Allied engineers could crank up manifold pressure, pushing their engines to higher outputs. The Fiat's simple single-stage supercharger, combined with poor fuel, left the C.200 gasping for breath. Emergency power barely reached 960 horsepower, and only at specific altitudes. Everywhere else, the Saetta was sluggish. For pilots, this weakness was more than numbers on a chart. It was a daily nightmare. They knew that in level flight, they couldn't outrun Spitfires or P-40S. They knew climbing too high meant bleeding power. And they knew that if caught by American bombers, their underpowered guns weren't backed up by an engine that could help them escape. Yes, the C.200's lightweight design made it maneuverable, even giving it advantages in a turn fight. But pilots understood the trade-off. Agility came at the cost of raw survival power. Allied planes had engines that grew stronger with every year of the war. The Fiat A74 remained shackled by fuel quality and outdated design. For men flying the Saetta, that meant every mission carried the unshakable fear that no matter how skilled they were, their engine simply wasn't up to the fight. If there was one statistic that haunted every Macchi C.200 pilot, it was this: 2. That's all they had, 2 12.7mm machine guns mounted in the nose. Against nimble enemy fighters, that could be enough, provided you stayed on target long enough. Against American bombers, armored and bristling with defensive firepower, it was laughably inadequate. Most Allied fighters of the early war mounted at least 6 guns. By 1941, Spitfires carried 8.303s or 220mm cannons. American P-40S and later Mustangs shredded the skies with concentrated firepower. The Saetta's twin guns forced Italian pilots to creep dangerously close to their enemies, often within 100 yards, before opening fire. At that range, a single mistake or a few bursts from a bomber's defensive gunners could spell disaster. Ammo supply was another issue. With only 2 guns, each firing around 750 rounds per minute, a pilot had mere seconds of effective fire. Precision shooting wasn't just a virtue in the Saetta, it was survival. A missed burst meant an empty magazine long before the enemy was done fighting back. Italian engineers attempted upgrades, experimenting with fitting additional smaller caliber guns, but production never caught up to battlefield reality. Pilots knew every mission was stacked against them. Even if they outturned an opponent, even if they survived the flak and pushed their engine to its limits, bringing down a bomber required nerves of steel and almost surgical aim. The fear wasn't just of death, it was of futility. Facing swarms of Allied bombers with 2 lonely guns felt like charging a tank with a pistol. Brave Italian aviators pressed on regardless, but deep down, they knew the Saetta was underarmed for the war it was thrown into. The Macchi C.200 wasn't just feared for its lack of firepower, it was also littered with quirks that made pilots question its reliability. The strangest of these? It had 2 separate airspeed indicators, each with its own pitot-static system. On paper, redundancy might sound like a luxury, but for pilots, it raised more questions than answers. Why 2? Which one could be trusted when they didn't match? In combat, doubt was the last thing you wanted creeping into your head. Then came the throttle, working backwards, compounding confusion. Add to that a set of exhaust manifolds so crudely designed they robbed the engine of performance, their pipes bending sharply downward instead of providing thrust. Even young cadets could see wasted potential in the engineering. The Saetta did have innovations, like an air-driven starter and an integrated fire extinguishing system, features rare at the time. But they often felt like band-aids slapped onto deeper flaws. Italian mechanics were skilled, but spare parts were scarce, and pilots were keenly aware that a jammed flap or a clogged line could mean never returning home. And while the raised cockpit gave excellent forward visibility, it came with a trade-off. Sitting so high, the pilot was perched almost unnaturally above the fuselage, a vulnerable silhouette that invited enemy gunfire. In turn, fights, being an easy target, was not a confidence booster. For pilots, every oddity eroded trust. You can forgive quirks in a peacetime aircraft, but in combat, quirks kill. The Macchi C.200 may have looked beautiful on the ground, but in the cockpit, its strangeness bred fear. Italian aviators didn't just fight the enemy, they fought their own doubts about the very machine carrying them into battle. Even if the Macchi C.200 had been flawless, even if its quirks could be overlooked, Italian pilots faced a reality that terrified them more than any design flaw: numbers. The Allies built aircraft in staggering quantities, while Italy's industrial output could never keep pace. The United States alone produced an average of 248 planes per day in 1943 to 1944. That meant in a single week, American factories rolled out more aircraft than Italy could produce in months. The Saetta, with only around 1,500 units built in total, was destined to be overwhelmed by sheer arithmetic. Pilots knew this. Every time they scrambled, they weren't just outgunned, they were outnumbered 10 to 1. A handful of C-200s would face squadrons of Hurricanes, Spitfires, or P-40, backed by bomber streams that seemed endless. Even when Italians achieved impressive kill ratios on the Eastern Front, sometimes 5 to 1 against Soviet aircraft, it didn't matter. Losses were quickly replaced. Psychologically, this imbalance was crushing. Italian aces fought bravely, but for every victory, more Allied machines appeared on the horizon. A pilot could down an enemy one day, only to face double the numbers the next. Courage and skill meant little against assembly lines churning out fighters around the clock. This knowledge sat heavy in the cockpit. Fear wasn't just about being shot down, it was about the hopelessness of the fight. Pilots realized they weren't flying war winners, they were flying placeholders, doomed to delay the inevitable. The Saetta might survive a duel, but in the grand sweep of World War II, it was outbuilt, outmatched, and ultimately outclassed before the battle even began. The Macchi C.200 Saetta's legacy is a strange mix of respect, frustration, and outright fear. Pilots who flew it often admitted that, in the right circumstances, it could be a delight. Light on the controls, agile in turns, and capable of outmaneuvering even Spitfires or Hurricanes in close combat, the Saetta earned a reputation as a pilot's airplane. For young aviators fresh out of training, it was forgiving enough to inspire confidence. But beneath that surface charm lurked hard truths every combat veteran understood. The first was its sheer lack of firepower. Facing Allied fighters armed with 6 or 8 guns, or bombers built to soak up punishment, the Saetta's 2 nose-mounted weapons felt like pea shooters. Pilots often joked that they needed to empty an entire belt of ammo just to scratch a flying fortress. The joke carried nervous laughter because deep down, everyone knew it was close to the truth. The second reality was its inability to grow. Allied fighters evolved year by year, gaining speed, firepower, and armor. The Saetta remained essentially the same airplane it had been in 1940. Italian industry couldn't match Allied innovation, and without higher octane fuel or better superchargers, the Fiat A74 engine left pilots perpetually outpaced. Each new Allied model that entered service widened the gap until the Saetta was hopelessly outdated. For pilots, flying the C-200 meant fighting with courage rather than equipment. They squeezed every advantage out of its nimble airframe, using its tight turns and reliable structure to snatch victories against the odds. Many aces proved the Saetta could still bite, yet every mission carried the knowledge that survival depended more on luck and skill than on the airplane itself. The legacy of the Macchi C.200 isn't one of triumph. It is the story of brave men forced to fight a modern war with a machine already slipping into the past. The Macchi C.200 Saetta stands as one of World War II's most paradoxical fighters. Elegant in design yet flawed in execution, it represented the best Italy could field at the time and the limits of its aviation industry. For the men who flew it, fear was ever present. Fear of the open cockpit at high altitude, of throttles that betrayed instinct, of engines too weak for survival, and of hopelessly small numbers against overwhelming Allied skies. Yet, despite those flaws, Italian pilots fought with honor, turning the Saetta into more than just a machine. It became a symbol of resilience, of daring in the face of impossible odds. Today, we remember the C-200 not only for its shortcomings but for the bravery of the aviators who risked everything in a fighter that was as unforgiving as it was unforgettable.